good afternoon to everybody. I would like to welcome all of you to our today's panel, which is our fourth webinar in a series that we organized together as Chapter Zero Alliances and McKinsey. My name is Lucyna Stańczak-Buczyńska. I am a chair of Chapter Zero Poland board and also chair of BNP Paribas Bank in Poland with some other non-executive roles. And I am more than happy to welcome you. We have an extremely interesting topic for a discussion, and this is climate adaptation and the role of the financial institutions. The importance of the adaptation finance, as we see over last years, is substantially growing, and we will hear more about its nature and causes and how to mitigate it shortly. We would like also to look at the perspective of the financial institutions from the global perspective, as well as hopefully we will have a chance to discuss what should be the role or the awareness of the board of directors in this process. To guide us through this topic, I am more than happy to ask first my two colleagues from McKinsey to give us a scene, and then we will have a discussion with a very distinguished list of panelists. If the time allows, we also hope to have a Q&A session from the questions that you are more than welcome to send us via the chat. We will also be recording this session, and then I hope you will be able to find it on Chapter Zero Alliances Financial Sector Hub, where we are all belonging. So let me start with the introduction of my McKinsey colleagues, who will be so kind to give us a short presentation setting the global scene. So we have Mekhala Krishnan. Mekhala is a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute. This is the business and economic research arm of McKinsey. Her research will focuses on topics related to sustainable and inclusive growth, including climate risk and net zero transition, globalization, productivity, growth, and gender economics. The most recent research focused on net zero transition, adaptation, and physical climate risk across the sector and geographies. And Mekhala is an author of the recent MGI report on advancing adaptation, mapping costs from cooling to coastal defense. And I do hope that we will be able to see the link to this report in our chat. Together with Mekhala, we will have Simona Biscardi. She will join the presentation. Simona works with us as Chapter Zero Alliances for a long time already, so I'm very pleased she found time. Simona is a partner at McKinsey, part of the European Risk and Resilience practice and the sustainability practice, leading climate change in Europe and EMEA. Simona also works intensively with the financial institutions, both in the private and public sector, including financial regulator and supervisors. After the presentation, I am very happy that one of our colleagues from Chapter Zero Alliances FS Hub, Emma Hutterman, will lead the conversation with our distinguished panelists. Emma is an experienced climate finance and impact investing professional with a decade of leadership experience in development finance institutions, including British International Investment and FMO, when Emma was focusing on mobilizing capital towards sustainable growth and climate-aligned investment in emerging markets. Emma has also served on the investment committee of FSD Africa, contributing to disciplined capital allocation and governance in frontier market. It has held multiple non-executive roles. Currently, Emma serves as a CFO of Solar Duck, which is an advancing innovative offshore solar solutions. So we have a fantastic group of people. Emma then will introduce our panelists, and in order to move on and jump in immediately to our presentation, I will give the floor to Simona and Makala. So please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for this opportunity to share our research. As was mentioned, we recently did a big piece of work on climate adaptation. And the link is in the chat. It's a big report, 100+ pages, so I don't mean to go through every little detail of the research, but what we wanted to do is to give you a quick tour of the work, just to ground us before we head into the panel discussion. What we did with the research is what I would describe as a first of its kind comprehensive global assessment of adaptation costs around the world, built geospatially, pixel by pixel, understanding climate hazards in different parts of the world, and using that grounding in climate science and the understanding of climate hazards to then understand adaptation costs. So let's actually start there in what the climate science tells us. As I said, the grounding was in the science. We used best-in-class climate models across 4 different categories of hazards. We looked at heat, things like heat stress, which is long periods of hot and humid conditions, things like heat waves, more acute periods of high heat, wildfire, drought, and different forms of flooding to understand how is the world exposed today. And what you see in blue on this map is exposure around the world, where the blue indicates places that are exposed to at least one of these 4 categories of hazards already today. And that translates already today to about 40% of the world area that's exposed to these different kinds of events. Now, of course, that's not static. With a changing climate, what you see is that if you click ahead to 1.5C and then ahead to 2C, 2 things start to happen. The first is that you've obviously observed that the blue area starts to expand on the map. So more and more regions start to be exposed to these hazards, heat, wildfire, drought, or flooding. The second thing not visible on the map, but that also happens, is that regions that are exposed start to experience hazards more intensely. So an example of that would be a place that's exposed to heat stress. Today, on average, experiences 12 weeks of extremely hot and humid conditions. At 2C, that 12 weeks would increase to 16 weeks. So basically 2 things happen with climate change. More regions start to experience climate hazards, and those that do start to experience it more intensely. Now, the good news is that in response to climate, as I said, 40% of the world already experiences these kinds of events today. Many proven adaptation measures have been developed to manage exposure to these hazards. This is everything from cooling systems to irrigation systems to flood defenses like sea dikes. So what we did in our research is we examined 20 of these adaptation measures, things like air conditioners, irrigation, etc. And we chose these 20 because they provide robust protection, are used in many parts of the world. So what we find with those 20 measures is that they're already applied in many parts of the world today. So let me explain what I mean by that. If we take the 40% of world area that is exposed to climate hazards, that translates to 4 billion people around the world who are currently exposed. And 1 billion of them that primarily live in high and middle income places already use adaptation measures of the kinds that I described below. They have robust forms of protection. But what that means, that's the good news. However, the challenge and what that means is that about 2.9 billion people, if you click ahead, have limited forms of protection. They haven't actually adopted the sorts of measures that exist largely in developed parts of the world. And most of these 2.9 billion people live in low-income places. So on the one hand, good news, we have many adaptation measures to manage exposure to these hazards. The not so good news is that these measures are not uniformly adopted everywhere in the world. What does this mean in terms of how the world spends on adaptation? If you click ahead to the next slide, the 1.2 billion people that are exposed to climate hazards today, if you click ahead, spend about $190 billion annually to protect themselves. This is both operating expenditures, things like electricity costs to run air conditionings. It's also capital costs, things like the capital costs associated with building flood defenses. However, what that means is that because of the resiliency gap that I described on the previous page, with 2.9 billion people with limited protection, the world is not spending as much already today that it could be spending to protect all 4 billion people exposed. If the world wanted to protect all 4 billion people exposed, we would need to spend vastly more than what we're spending today, a total of about $540 billion. Now, this is not a static picture as we saw on the first slide. The climate is changing. And at 2 degrees Celsius of warming, the picture looks actually quite different than the picture today. Now, 2 degrees Celsius of warming, just to ground us, is what the world is expected to reach in 2050 on our current trajectory of emissions. At that warming level, even just to protect at the current protection levels with current protection and penetration rates, the world will need to spend substantially more, 2.5 times more, translating to $470 billion. This is again because more places are exposed and more places are exposed more intensely. And fully protecting the world would increase spending substantially more if you click ahead. To fully protect the world, to protect everyone that is exposed at 2C, the world would need to spend 6 times as much as what we're spending today, $1.2 trillion. So regardless of how we cut it, if we just maintain current protection levels where not everyone is protected, if we expand protection such that everyone in the world is protected, in either of those scenarios, the world is going to be spending more on adaptation, anywhere from 2.5 times to 6 times what we're spending today. How does that spending break down? If you move to the next slide, which you got a little bit of a preview of before, the vast majority of that spending, the pink and orange shades on this slide, will go towards protecting to heat and drought. And this is simply because as the climate changes, the largest land area that is exposed to hazards, the most people that are exposed to hazards are exposed to heat and drought. And about 3/4 of that $1.2 trillion will be heat and drought related spending, with two measures, air conditioning and irrigation, accounting for more than 50% of costs. Flooding also matters, though that's in fewer parts of the world, just because of the geographic nature of these hazards. And similarly, wildfires as well are in a smaller geographical expanse. So that's why in the yellow, the wildfire related spending is less. But you see with this work, what we've done is this geospatial assessment. And so we have the ability to say where in the world will what sorts of spending be needed. And with that, it'll allow for financial institutions, for policymakers, for multilateral development institutions to really think about how to target and direct adaptation finance effectively in the world. Now, we've talked all about all of this in a way that talks about it as costs, but actually this is not really a cost, it's actually an investment. And I say that because the reason one spends on adaptation is because you get a return. And that return is in the form of avoided damages. There are a whole range of losses that are avoided by investing in adaptation measures, everything from protecting to damages to infrastructure, to thinking about protecting labor productivity, to thinking about human health impacts. And the good news is, as we look at all of these 20 measures, and you see the 20 listed on this slide, all of them have positive benefit to cost ratios, meaning that their benefits in terms of avoided damages far exceed their costs. All of them have benefit to cost ratios of more than 1.5, and about 80% of the $1.2 trillion spending that I described is in measures that have benefit to cost ratios that exceed 3. And so the question really facing the world is, we have a good buy, which is adaptation. We're not spending enough today. We need to be spending more going forward. And so how do we rally an ecosystem of stakeholders, policymakers, real economy actors, and financial institutions to drive capital to where it's needed? And so with that, let me hand over to Simona, who's going to talk about the role of financial institutions in driving and delivering that adaptation finance.
Thank you, Michaela, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Also from my side, Simona Viscardi. We have already met each other, most probably in the other occasions and workshop we had with CGI. I'm a partner of the European Risk and Resilience Practice and Sustainability, and I lead our work for financial institutions in Europe. So, as Michaela was saying, we would move to what is now the role of a financial institution, what it has been so far, and what we see going forward. Can I ask to move to the next page? So as we can see in this page, adaptation has been historically a public topic. Public topic means that the most of the investments have been done by multilateral and development banks, development funds, with also a sustained amount of grants. Now, what is striking in this page is that private sector financial institutions and corporate and investors are accounting for less than 10% of the total. This does not include private individual self-investment. However, this is for sure not the kind of balance that we would expect to have a proper deployment on the 1.2 trillion that Mekala was describing in the first chapter. Moving to the next page, we come, however, with some good news. So there is a list of themes, and these themes are mapped to the other colors that Mekala has shown in the previous session, which we consider quote unquote bankable. Why do we consider the most of them bankable? Because these technologies are mature, they have a proven business case, they have impact near term, so they can provide impact and benefits on climate resilience really in the years to come. And they've also a sustainable scalability. Now, this is an amount that we see from here to 2030. And it's meant to be for almost half on building resilience. And this has to do with cooling, with heating, with insulation, as Mekala was already saying before. A common ground topic across all these elements is grid. Grid is not only a topic for mitigation, as we have discussed already in the past, and very prominent in Europe, but it's also a topic in terms of adaptation. Why? For two reasons. First of all, because the infrastructure will need to be resilient to more and more frequent negative events. And second, because we want, when the event occurs, that the infrastructure itself is not damaging the rest of the surroundings. And this has to do with the innovation in undergrounding that we are observing these days. Another topic is logistic and supply chain. So how to ensure that we are cooling the transport and the logistic of goods, water infrastructure. How can we ensure that in presence of flooding, which are increasing droughts and also increasing pollution, how do we make sure that water is still available from different sources, or from how do we make sure that we reduce the waste around water? And the last topic that I would mention on this page is really on agriculture. So with the increase of droughts, agriculture needs to be ready for more intermittent water. And as a consequence, what are the technologies that are allowing for that? Behind these themes that we have on this page, there are identified, as I mentioned, mature near-term benefits and with the significant growth potential and scalability technology, which financial institutions should be looking at to invest. Moving to the next page, we have what is the role that the different player in the financial institutions ecosystem should play. We will hear from Giampiero in the panel around what development banks are doing. It was already evident from the first picture that they are currently the ones that are making the most of it, but how the role of public to private can improve. In terms of banks, we will see some examples of how banks can push adaptation, and we will hear more from Franco and Gianluca also as part of the panel. And similarly to private equity and venture capital, which should sustain more at the early movers and the scale-ups and startups. Now, I want to focus a bit on insurance here because insurance plays a very important role in this case. So before the event, insurance pricing and incentives are really the ones which can support investments into climate resilience. And we will see later some players that are effectively support with credit programs climate resilience. After the event, insurances can push towards reconstructed in a way which is climate resilience. And on top of that, insurances are for sure a source of capabilities in terms of advanced risk management and detection that can be shared with the broader ecosystem. I want to move into the next page. I want to leave you with some very positive examples that we have seen in the markets. Because the private sector involvement, despite not enough and not at the level it should be, is indeed growing and has grown over the last years. One example is this program from Standard Chartered for Middle East and USA in order to make sure that photovoltaic farms are benefited from guarantees, and so the contractors and the developers can access to facilitated fundings leverages these guarantees. The second example is the one of corporate insurance companies, FM, which has created credit programs in order for policyholders to invest into resilience for the respective plans and for the respective buildings and operations in a way that the insurance premium can be decreased to the extent that the investment is properly done. And finally, a fund which was launched by Lightsmith Group in the context of COP30, which is a fund which is totally dedicated to adaptation in the form of funding, in the form of equity credit, but also technical assistance to the companies who want to evolve in this space. So, as I said, the private sector has started moving. We are still, let's say, in pioneering situation. We will hear more from our panelists how we see the way forward. Thank you, everyone.
I think that is a great bridge to move to our panel and see how what things are happening in practice in their respective areas. We've also already seen some questions coming in, so we're hoping to have time for questions from all participants at the end. So please continue to write those questions, and we'll see if we can get a few answers at the end as well. I'd love to start with Giampiero. He's a managing director of climate strategy and delivery at EBRD. Before that, also Director of Sustainable Business and Infrastructure in the Climate Strategy and Delivery Department, and has been responsible for climate finance, business support, and green policy engagements for the corporate, energy, and infrastructure sectors. So, Giampiero, you are responsible for coordinating EBRD's work on resilience, just transition, and nature finance. And EBRD has long been at the forefront of climate finance. Could you please share with us some insights on how these products have been working in practice, how successful they have been, and whether you have any lessons learned? And additionally, perhaps you could share what you see in your network of investors in terms of what they expect of MDBs and DFIs to be able to act on adaptation. Because we saw in the presentation that's a very large chunk of what's going into adaptation finance at the moment.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking Chapter Zero, Lucina in particular, for this invitation. I'm a big fan of Chapter Zero, so I'm very delighted to be here and share some of the work we're doing, but also more in general, have a conversation about this very important topic. maybe since also both Simona and Mekhala mentioned MDBs, maybe I'll start from there because I like to maybe frame the conversation in a way that we try to bring all these elements together. So let me start by saying that this type of analysis that Simona and Mekhala shared are very important. But if you think about, these are conversation, analysis, assessment that in the mitigation world we've seen 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So it shows that because of its complexity, because it has been for too long remit of the public discourse and not so much about private sector, we are behind when it comes to the definition of the role of the financial sector more in general on addressing the adaptation challenge and the needs for enhancing climate resilience. So maybe that's the first element to consider. And that's why, again, this type of analysis is so relevant. Because of this, the work we've done in the MDBs, broadly speaking, is try to work on developing the mechanics that underpin the conversation about adaptation finance. And we've done this in a variety of ways, trying to bring some discipline and coherence in the way we do the climate risk assessment. We look at climate vulnerabilities and climate hazards and how we incorporate these elements in the way we look at investments and projects, but also in the engagement versus our clients, being private sector or countries. And one element that I think is very important, at least in the context of what we do in the MDB space, is how to incorporate, all MDBs as of 2023 have incorporated Paris alignment considerations in the way they review projects, right? So we all commit to be fully Paris aligned, which means that we are fully Paris aligned also in the context of understanding physical climate risk and using this analysis to inform our investment decisions. So that's one element. The second element of the mechanics of the elements that contribute to expand the provision of adaptation finance is really looking at the very definition what adaptation finance is, how to track it, how to report it. And again, that's an area where we've been doing some work for the last few years. There is now a methodology. We report every year adaptation of finance in our joint NDB climate finance tracking report. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to look into it, because also there is all the methodological elements that underpin the methodology. But I want also to make one point clear, that adaptation finance per se is a bit of it's a necessary but insufficient metric, because unlike mitigation finance, which is almost linearly correlated to impact and outcomes, adaptation finance is not. So there is an intrinsic limitation to how adaptation finance can be utilized in order to, again, achieve outcomes and so one important, why I'm mentioning this, because in the context of the role of the financial sector, there are perhaps other metrics that are more relevant, and we need to work, jointly to develop these metrics. Can be value at risk, can be the value of assets that in fact are characterized by enhanced resilience. So there are a number of metrics that probably matter at least as much as adaptation finance in the context of defining the benefits of working in this sector. The second pillar of the mechanics, or let's say the key component, it's about dedicated financial products. And in the last few years, there's been quite an extensive work in this area. And I will mention two examples. One is climate resilience bonds. At DBRD, we've been working on this topic for the last 5-6 years. We worked with the climate bond initiatives to develop a methodology. And we issue climate resilient bonds ourselves as on the back of the climate adaptation portfolio of our investments we've financed over the years. And what we've noticed that there is an appetite in the market. We've seen a number of investors buying EBRD issuance, EBRD risk, because of this feature. So clearly there is an interest there. Another product I would like to highlight is sustainability linked loans. So we've seen a growing interest from private players to incorporate, to look into result-based finance. And, we've been developing, with a number of clients, adaptation or resilience correlated KPIs that can be then used to structure a financial product around. And this is an area that we believe there is more that can be done. There is still a lack of methodological alignment. And there is it's a space that could be interesting also in in terms of creating an interest from investors. And maybe going to the last point, you asked you about investors. So this is an area that at DBRD we are particularly involved, engaged. We work primarily with private investors. We are interested to scale up, private finance. And what we heard in the last few months, we established a bit more structured dialogue with the private investors. So we had what we called a private mobilization task force. And one of the topics has been adaptation, right? And I think there are three things that emerge from this interaction. One is a growing demand for standardization. So ranging from standardized due diligence packages to more clear methodology for climate risk assessment that speak to the private investors. So the standardization is a quite important element and also has an impact in terms of not only investment decisions, but also in reducing transaction costs. Maybe I should have started by saying that, let's say, there are more sophisticated investors, a bit less sophisticated investors, but the baseline at the moment, when a private investors look into an adaptation project, they look at it in a very binary way. So whether, they look at whether the risk is basically looking in terms of whether the risk is sustainable for them or not. So they're not necessarily trying to understand the nuances of how different risk profile can be ultimately considered in their investment decision. So standardization, clear call. The second is the call, and again, they're looking at MDBs as a way to progress on this agenda, is about dedicated structured finance. That, ranging from blended finance instruments, but also looking at de-risking instruments that use different type of capital to address specific risk dimension. And the third one is what I would call more generically, working on the bankability of adaptation investments. Simone and Michaela made a lot of connection, between the cost and benefits of adaptation investment. Ultimately, there is something that they didn't mention, that they looked at the profitability or the economic feasibility of this project, looking at the lenses of reduction in reconstruction sort of cost or reduce disruption in the business. But ultimately, there are a lot of synergy that can be incorporated. When you look into interventions in terms of heat resilience in the built environment, you can couple with energy efficiency interventions or interventions that ultimately address the geophysical risk, the earthquake risk. So if you put this together, and there is another area where we haven't progressed enough. But if you bring these elements together, actually the profitability, the return on investment could be even higher. However, there is a problem. So the problem is that while the benefits are clear and undisputed by now, I would say, clearly these benefits are fragmented. And it's very difficult, still very difficult to make a commercial case about adaptation finance. So what we're working as MDBs, and this is an area also where, at DBRD we're quite active, is trying to identify models that ultimately generate, or let's say, make this commercial case most clear. One example is looking at models as resilience as a service. There's a growing demand for resilience services. And, there is experience in other sectors, infrastructure development, for example, that use these type of models to reward investors. So again, it's really about progressing with a bit of a financial engineering to also look at the lessons from other sectors.
Thanks, Gianpiero. And I'm actually going to be really cheeky because I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question because I'm interested, so I'm assuming everybody else is. When you look at sort of the value at risk that you mentioned, and that sort of links to what the benefits are that I think McKinsey also identified in their reports. How do you look at those? And can you give us an example of sort of an adaptation KPI that you track in your sustainability linked loans?
Yes. So in terms of the value at risk, we're looking at this at the moment very sporadically. When really there is a type of asset where this is evident and is part of our decision-making process, it's part of the credit risk assessment. As a general metric, this is my personal view. I like more, highlighting the value of the assets that ultimately have enhanced resilience, are characterized by enhanced resilience. I like that metric more because ultimately speak a bit more about an opportunity, but also can be correlated also to macro indicators like share of GDP, for example, right? And this is where you can connect finance with policy. But let's say we do work on value at risk in the context of specific infrastructure projects where we want to understand, how that metric can inform the credit risk analysis, but it's done relatively sporadically and in a few cases. So your other question, sorry.
Just the KPIs that you say you were tracking. Yeah.
So the KPIs at the moment, okay, we are working in two directions. So on one direction, we have a number of clients, for example, in the agri-food sector, where we are looking at a variety of KPIs to structure, for example, sustainability-linked loans. And these KPIs can be related to water efficiency, can be related to exposure to, or let's say, implementation of specific risk management tools. So and we haven't yet done an SLL that is focused exclusively on adaptation. So it's more like in a variety of KPIs, we are increasingly introducing this type of metrics. But at the same time, one aspiration we have, and we already started some conversation, is to look at how to build this KPI in a more systematic way, a more kind of repeatable way. And this is a work we're trying to do also with some of the leading organizations like LMA or ICMA. So because clearly we want to make sure that these considerations are taken, on board by the broader actors in the financial sector. But again, water efficiency would be typically one. Even the introduction in the agri-food sector is about the actors on that are farmed with precision agriculture, which again goes into the direction of water consumption. Or adoption or early warning system. We're looking at something like that, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. But they tend to be relatively discrete KPIs. I think the ambition is to have one SLL which is entirely focused on adaptation.
That is ambitious and a great goal. And I would like to urge everyone to also look at the sort of resources that EBRD has made publicly available, because they can.
Sorry to take, in terms of resources, I just want to highlight, last year with the MDBs at COP30 in Brazil, we issued a compendium of best practice in terms of finance and policy on adaptation. So I would really invite you to look into it, because I think it's a good reference. You can see really such a variety of interventions. So happy to share the link later.
If you would, that'd be great. Thank you so much, Giampiero. Moving to Yassine. Yassine is a partner with Afrique Invest, which is a Pan-African multi-asset class investment platform. He has led multiple transactions end-to-end for both early and growth stage investments. Innovative companies in different sectors across regions, in sort of both disruptive and inclusive products. Yassine, you were the first one to be in charge of the Tunisia Small Cap Fund, and you've worked on several investments, specifically in North Africa, but also West Saharan Africa. And now you are co-leading the Afrique Invest Pan-African Venture Capital Strategy and the Afrique Invest Climate Initiative. So I think you're the right person to ask. We are seeing private equity firms moving towards the opportunity, but it's still sort of relatively small, as we could see in McKinsey's presentation. Afrique Invest is itself currently building a vehicle to finance climate solutions. Can you tell us about the strategy of that vehicle and its ambitions? And are there any lessons learned so far that you can share with us?
Thank you, Emma, and thanks everyone for this invitation. I'm glad to join this super important discussion. Let me start first with the market overview and what we see. Maybe first on the private equity side, and then going into more the VC side of things and earlier stage deals. On the private equity, it's very interesting that we see more and more interest on both fronts. First, on the investment, where we see a number of deals being done in companies that are in the climate and adaptation space, be it in the irrigation, in the cold storage, in the agriculture. We see announcement happening from us or our colleagues. But the other thing that we see is in the processes, both on the investment and the monitoring, where we are taking into account more and more the climate adaptation in the value addition that we provide to our investees, right? Working with tomato grower in North Africa to develop seeds that are more resilient to water stress. Working with the telco tower company in sub-Saharan Africa to position its infra and making more resilient to floods. And here is the same sectors that Simona mentioned a bit earlier, or working with an insurance company also to develop weather indexed insurance product. So all these works are being done in specifically in our portfolio companies, and the interest from the mature stage of the private investment space is real. Now, if we look at the VC type of companies and the earlier stage and the tech-enabled, it's super interesting to see how the split of investment has been developing across the years. Climate this year has become the second largest sector to attract VC money after fintech. If you look a few years ago, fintech was more than 50% of the investment were going to fintech. Now this year we have a little bit more than 1/3 to fintech, 1/3 to climate, and then 1/3 to the other sectors. Here, of course, the definition of climate is very large. It includes energy, mobility, food, nature-based solution, waste, recycling, etc. Can be asset-heavy business model, asset-light business model. But still, I mean, these are small companies that some of them will grow and develop. And this is what we want to finance with our new fund. And we want to go into growth financing and help these second wave of climate finance that we see in the market grow. The first wave of climate finance was really, for me, mostly focusing on small on SHS, so solar home systems. That I mean, were financed 10, 20 years ago. They were early stage and they were developed trying to solve one big problem in Africa, which is we have 500 million population that do not have access to electricity, right? So today we created this typology of companies that's been able to attract mature funding, institutional funding, and have been able to reach, I think in Africa, around 45 million people have access to electricity, to power, thanks to this typology of companies. We ourselves invested through our private equity fund in one of the leading players in this space. But this is the first phase of climate finance and what we've been able to achieve. Now we see this second phase with a lot of diversity in the solution. And we want to foster the growth and development of these companies that have positive impact on the climate, adaptation and mitigation. But adaptation is very important for us, and we want to focus on two things. One is increasing food security. This is one topic, and the second one is building resilient infrastructure. We're looking at it from two subsegments. One is the built environment that Jean-Pierre mentioned, and the second one is in the mobility. And our hope is, and we can go in later into more details about our strategy and the fund, but our hope is really to see some of these solutions grow, scale, and have a meaningful impact, like solar home systems did for the African population.
Thank you, Yassine. Do you have in this new fund a specific allocation for adaptation, or are you using it sort of as a fluent topic within sort of the broader climate focus that you have?
So we have a focus. We have a split per sectors, but we don't have a split for adaptation specifically. But we see that today many of our companies have both sides. We have mitigation and adaptation. And looking at our pipeline, I think more than 70% of our pipeline companies have an adaptation angle.
And in your sort of investment decisions, like EBRD was saying, we also basically take it along climate risk as part of the risks in our in our credit assessments. In your investment decisions, does that risk or that mitigation of that risk take part as well?
So in our investment decision, and this is today true across all our funds. We have a platform that manage private equity, venture capital, private credit funds, and across our funds we have a due diligence process that includes looking at the climate adaptation angle. We have an impact and sustainability team of 6 people that are specialized in this and look at the different angle at the investment stage, where they intervene quite early in our processes. And then, of course, we have the due diligence, the detailed due diligence in all of our deals, but they also help us on the value creation stage. So we try to help all this company become more resilient, because we believe, I mean, if they're more resilient, they have more chances also of success. To become more resilient and to develop products and services that cope with this risk. And of course, we have KPIs that we follow. We try to have 2 tiers of KPIs. One tier that is at the portfolio level that can be adapted for all typology of companies, and then we have KPIs for each portfolio company that we follow.
I'm a sucker for a good KPI. Can you give me an example?
So the ones we look at portfolio, I mean at portfolio level, which is try to apply to the diversity of the sectors that we look at. I mean, pretty simple, but one is on the mitigation side is the emissions. On the adaptation side, we look at the people, at the number of the people that have been
People affected.
Yeah, exactly. And the third one is the one that Giampiero mentioned is the assets that are made more resilient, and we try also to estimate that. I mean, of course, this is not scientific 100%, but we try to do the best estimation of this, and we try to build it in advance on our fundraising process to say, okay, what our portfolio would look like, what are the objectives for these KPIs, and then what can we achieve.
Thank you, Yassine. It's really nice to hear. It's just part of your normal investment process, but even better to hear that it's also part of your value creation plans with your investees. Thanks for sharing those insights. If I can move on to you, Gianluca, as the risk executive for climate, nature, and social risk at JP Morgan, you protect the bank via a global network of sort of consistent risk appetite and governance processes, assessing and managing climate, nature, and social risk, with which the bank could be associated through the financial services you provide to the client, sort of transactional as well as on portfolio level. You've been doing this also in the past with Credit Suisse as their global head of sustainability climate risk. JP Morgan is currently increasingly active on climate adaptation. And you've published a report recently, I mean, in May 2025, on unlocking resilience through strategic climate adaptation. Could you tell us more on where JP Morgan is on the path to seizing these economic opportunities that McKinsey mentioned? And what does it take for the bank to be able to engage in climate finance adaptation, to finance climate adaptation?
Sure, with pleasure. And thanks very much for the invite. I'm delighted to be here. And I will also predict you're going to ask me about a KPI at some point.
Oh, I will.
I will try to preempt that question. So look, I think, what I heard today from Simona, Mekala, Yassine, and Giampiero, I think it resonates a lot with the way we look at the topic, right? So at JP Morgan, we're looking at adaptation as a critical pillar of our sustainability strategy. We look at it as an opportunity for business as well, for us, but also literally for value creation of the clients in the first place. The way we're looking at the topic is to try to put all of the facts and all of the figures together. An adaptation investment may not be as straightforward as other investments for a number of reasons. When people talk about 1 in 100 years events, there could be the reaction of saying, okay, I take the risk. I don't invest to protect against that. It's a 1% probability. If you look at it from the perspective of cumulative probability, it means that for a 30-year asset, you have a 26% of probability of that event happening, which is kind of the same number, right? It's the same mathematics. But I think it's important to frame, what is your time horizon that you care about? For how long do you expect the asset to be there? And also not just looking at the insurance of the asset itself, but looking at the missed revenues potentially. But also all of the supply chain dependencies. Another aspect that we're looking at is the expectation from investors. You look at some of the figures, such as 90% of financing has gone toward mitigation as opposed to adaptation. These are figures, I think, from the IPCC panels and other sources. It sort of begs the question, why is that? Why 90% here and only 10% in adaptation? And there are a number of reasons behind that. One is obviously the moral imperative to try to avoid the worst for the planet. Secondly, there is a point on technology. You don't want to be left behind, and obviously you want to decarbonize fast. But there are other aspects, but one that is sometimes overlooked is what investors really expect you to do, right? And we're seeing more and more investors' interest. I think Yassine was confirming that more and more interest in how companies are preparing and adapting, for a warming planet. And in that context, if your company is expected to be less volatile in terms of revenues, then that creates value because investors will prefer companies which are well prepared to navigate through future scenarios. For us, it's therefore an approach that looks at, again, trying to put some mathematics around this, look at return on investment, overlooking with scenarios, warming planet by certain degrees. And I would just conclude by saying, that is, there is no simple KPI for us. It's that articulation of what it means financially for the company. And I think it is potentially a struggle if we want to harmonize things into a simple CO2 equivalent type of metric. But in this space, I'm not sure that type of metric really exists, and it might be counterproductive to just look for one that may not really capture the risk in totality. So, sorry, the very last thing I'll say is that I was at Mumbai Climate Week last week. I was there in person, and it was the first Climate Week in Mumbai, actually in India. And when we talked about adaptation, it was a very different discussion from the 1 in 100 years, trying to convince people that events are real. Events are happening already today. So there is a lot of thinking going into projects, infrastructural projects, when it comes to having adaptation at the forefront of the design.
I think I see what you're seeing as well, and I think that's what Yassine was also saying, almost that because those areas, and especially we could see that in the map of McKinsey, Africa and South Asia are already very heavily affected. It sort of becomes a new normal and a new factor that you need to take into account. And the reason I'm asking for KPIs, Gianluca, like you, is because it can be such a wide topic and it's hard to fit into one. So I'm trying to sort of get all the information out and see what's everybody else looking at.
Yeah, no, it's a totally fair question. I've seen clients also in very different phases of evolution. I've seen clients that would know perfectly, right, what their exposures are and would have mapped their supply chain and would have had some climate scientists maybe part of their teams, would have invested in startups. And these are the clients where sometimes you just, you worry, right, about speaking about the topic. They obviously know much more than you do about their own operations, but there are other clients actually that are still sort of starting on that journey, and they actually benefit from a view, let's say, higher level from a financial entity like JP Morgan or other big banks. But in that context, again, I think it is important that we look at adaptation as part of the business decision making when you have an arsenal of potential investments and you try to maximize your returns. Again, keeping in mind that investors are giving more and more value to this type of information about the resiliency of companies, much more than they used to do in the past.
Thank you. I'm sorry we're running out of time, because I would actually, Gianluca, love to hear more about if you see any friction between looking at transactional level and at portfolio level, like you do. But I'm afraid I've run out of time with me going rogue and asking follow-up questions. So I think I need to hand it back over to Lucina. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to thank all the speakers. I think it was really inspiring. And when we want to address our conversations to senior leaders, non-executive directors in the first place, so people who may not necessarily dive into the details, but this is the group of people that should promote the change, promote the resilience, make sure there is the right knowledge and understanding, first of all, how important the adaptation finance and investments are. And we have the enormous impact in terms of number of people, in terms of size of investment, in terms of future of assets and supply chain. And that actually this is not anymore, as Gian Piero said, the public sector matter. It is very much a business matter when it comes to investment decision, when it comes to resilience, when it comes to return. And also it's a great opportunity for the banking sector and the financial sector most globally, because we should add asset managers, we should add private equity, who are looking more and more into this area. So for me, the takeaways for our network community is to be very mindful and listen and ask questions and explore both on the risk side, which is visible and obvious, but also on the opportunity side and the social responsibility and the environment responsibility that we will all have, whether we are in a private equity firm or a financial institution. So I believe it's an extremely valuable lesson for all of us. We will put it on our webpage and hope some of the links we will add there if colleagues agree to it as an additional information. I really like the concept of the bond market, new standards for the adaptation finance. So looking forward to see more of clients coming out. And I'm also very pleased to see that some of the very large institutions are very mindful about the topic, as well as more private institutions and public. So I would like to thank you all so much for your presence. For me, it was also extremely interesting, and I'm sure for all our colleagues as well. So thank you so much.